The sound of champagne glasses clinking still haunts me. Not because it was a celebration, but because of what they were celebrating. I had driven 3 hours through November rain to spend Thanksgiving with my mother, arriving just as the sun disappeared behind her quiet neighborhood. What I found when I walked through that door would change everything I thought I knew about trust, family, and how far some people will go for money. I saw my mother, 74 years old, sitting at her own dining room table, with trembling hands holding a pen over a stack of documents. Across from her sat Gerald Bennett, her financial advisor for the past 8 months, his smile too wide, his eyes too eager. And beside him, his wife Patricia, already raising her glass of my mother's best wine, as if the deal were done. My mother's signature hadn't even dried on the first page when Patricia started clapping. Actually clapping, like my mother had just won something, instead of signing away the house my father had built with his own hands 40 years ago. My mother looked up when she heard me enter, and I saw something in her face that made my blood run cold. It wasn't confusion or surprise. It was resignation. Like she'd been waiting for someone to save her but had stopped believing anyone would come. Her fingers were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pen, and there were tears tracking down her face that she kept trying to wipe away before anyone noticed. Gerald stood up immediately, his smile never faltering. "Robert, wonderful to see you. Your mother and I were just finalizing some paperwork. Nothing for you to worry about." I didn't respond. I walked slowly to the table, my eyes never leaving those documents. I could see the words, "Property Transfer Agreement," at the top of the page. I looked at my mother. She wouldn't meet my eyes. "What's going on here?" I asked quietly. Patricia answered before my mother could speak. "Your mother is making smart financial decisions, that's what. Gerald's been helping her secure her future." I felt something twist inside my chest. 27 years I'd spent as a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department. 27 years of learning to recognize predators. And here I was, looking at 2 of them sitting in my mother's dining room, drinking her wine, stealing her home. Without a word, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. A number I'd sworn I'd never use again after I retired. But some promises get broken when the stakes are high enough. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "This better be good, Walker." "It's not," I said, my eyes still locked on Gerald's face. "I need you at my mother's house. Now. Bring everything." I hung up. Gerald's smile had finally started to crack. Patricia had stopped clapping. "Nobody leaves this house," I said calmly, setting my phone down on the table next to those papers my mother had been about to sign. "Before I continue, I want to ask you something. Have you subscribed to Whispered Vengeance? Have you hit that like button? Because what happens next, what I discovered over the following weeks, it's going to show you exactly why the truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep some people try to bury it." Gerald cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Robert, I understand you're protective of your mother, but this is really between her and me. These are legitimate financial planning documents." "Then you won't mind waiting while we review them," I replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from him. "You said it yourself. Nothing to worry about." He glanced at Patricia. She had gone very still, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. My mother sat between us all, smaller than I'd ever seen her, like she was trying to disappear into her chair. "Mom," I said gently, "why don't you tell me what Mr. Bennett here has been helping you with?" She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at Gerald as if asking permission to speak. That look told me more than any words could have. This wasn't the woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me to question everything, who'd never asked anyone's permission for anything in her life. Gerald said the house was becoming too expensive, she whispered. "The maintenance, the taxes. He said I could live here rent-free if I transferred it to his company, and they'd handle everything." "And in exchange?" I asked, though I already knew. "In exchange, when I pass away, the house goes to them instead of to you. But I get to live here the rest of my life, and they'll take care of all the bills." I felt my jaw tighten. I forced myself to breathe slowly. "And your savings? The account Dad left you?" Her eyes filled with fresh tears. "Gerald invested it. He said there was a guaranteed return. Something about offshore opportunities. How much did you invest, Mom? All of it, she whispered. $340,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. My father had worked double shifts for 30 years to build that nest egg. He died of a heart attack 2 years ago, probably from all those double shifts, leaving my mother comfortable and secure. And now it was gone. Gerald stood up abruptly. I don't appreciate these accusations, Robert. Your mother made these decisions freely. If you have concerns, you can speak to my attorney. I plan to, I said, not moving from my chair. In fact, I plan to speak to a lot of people about this. The doorbell rang. Gerald jumped. I smiled for the first time since I'd walked in. That was fast, I said, standing up. Mom, that's going to be my old partner from the fraud division. I hope you don't mind if he joins us. I walked to the door and opened it to find Marcus Chen standing there with a briefcase and a grim expression. Marcus had been the best financial crimes detective in Philadelphia before moving to the FBI's white-collar crime unit. We'd worked together for 15 years before I retired. I'd called in every favor I had left to get him here tonight. Marcus, come in. We're just having a friendly Thanksgiving discussion about financial planning. Marcus walked in, his eyes immediately scanning the room, taking in every detail the way he'd been trained to. The documents on the table, Gerald's rigid posture, Patricia's white-knuckled grip on her wine glass, my mother's tear-stained face. Mr. Bennett, Marcus said pleasantly, setting his briefcase down and pulling out a badge. FBI. I'm going to need to see some identification and those documents you were having Mrs. Walker sign. Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell backward. You can't just barge in here. This is private property. Ma'am, I was invited by the property owner's son, Marcus said calmly, and if you have nothing to hide, this should be a very brief conversation. I watched Gerald's face cycle through several emotions: anger, fear, calculation, and finally landing on something that looked like surrender, masked as cooperation. He reached for his wallet with movements that were just a touch too slow, buying time to think. Of course, Agent Chen. I'm always happy to cooperate with law enforcement. Marcus took Gerald's license and began photographing it with his phone. Then he turned his attention to the documents on the table, his expression growing darker with each page he read. Mrs. Walker, Marcus said after a long moment. Did Mr. Bennett explain to you that this transfer agreement includes a clause making you responsible for all property debts and back taxes, while simultaneously removing your ownership rights? My mother's face went pale. No, he said it would protect me from expenses. It does the opposite, Marcus said quietly. You'd be assuming liability with no asset protection. If anything went wrong, you'd lose the house and still owe the debt. I turned to Gerald. That's not financial planning. That's fraud. Gerald's face had gone red. This is a misunderstanding. These are standard clauses. Any lawyer would tell you. I am a lawyer, Patricia interrupted suddenly, her voice sharp. I reviewed these documents myself. They're perfectly legal. Legal and ethical aren't the same thing, Marcus said, pulling out a small recording device from his briefcase. Mrs. Walker, would you be willing to make a statement about your interactions with Mr. Bennett? She doesn't have to do anything, Patricia snapped. Gerald, we're leaving. Actually, Marcus said, positioning himself between them and the door, I'd prefer if you stayed. I have a few questions about those offshore investments Mrs. Walker mentioned. The room went very quiet. Through the window, I could see neighbors starting to gather on their porches, drawn by the unusual number of cars in my mother's driveway. The whole street would be talking about this by morning, but I didn't care about gossip. I cared about the way my mother was looking at me, hope beginning to replace that terrible resignation in her eyes. Gerald promised me guaranteed returns, my mother said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all night. 15% annually. He showed me documents, official-looking papers with seals and signatures. Do you still have those documents? Marcus asked. She nodded, standing up slowly. In my bedroom, I kept everything he gave me because... She trailed off, looking at Gerald with something like betrayal in her eyes. Because my husband always told me to keep records. Smart man, Marcus said gently. Would you show them to me? As my mother left the room with Marcus following, I stayed with Gerald and Patricia. The silence stretched between us, thick and hostile. Patricia kept glancing at her phone. Gerald stared at the table. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "How many others?" I asked quietly. Gerald looked up, and for a second I saw something genuine in his face. Not remorse, but calculation. He was weighing his options, trying to figure out if cooperation might save him. "I want immunity," he said. "You're not in a position to negotiate," I replied. "I am, if there's a bigger fish." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm not the only one doing this. There's a network. Multiple advisors, all working together, sharing leads on vulnerable clients." Patricia's head snapped toward him. "Gerald, shut up. Don't say another word." But Gerald kept talking, the words spilling out faster now. "Patricia's law firm provides the documents. We get a cut of everything. There are at least 20 other elderly people who've signed similar agreements in the past 2 years alone." I felt sick. 20 families. 20 people like my mother, trusting someone who saw them as nothing more than a payday. Marcus returned with my mother and a banker's box full of documents. He set it on the table with a heavy thud. "Mrs. Walker has been very organized. She has copies of everything, including some very interesting correspondence." He pulled out a sheaf of papers and began laying them across the table. Bank statements, investment prospectuses, email exchanges. And gradually, as I watched Marcus work, I saw the full scope of what had been done to my mother. The offshore investment wasn't real. The company didn't exist. The official-looking documents with their seals and signatures were forgeries. Gerald had taken my mother's life savings and funneled it through a series of shell companies that all led back to accounts controlled by him and Patricia. The house transfer would have been the final piece, leaving my mother penniless and homeless while owing debts she couldn't possibly pay. "You need to arrest them," I said to Marcus, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Right now." "I can't make arrests based solely on civil fraud," Marcus said. "But I can hold them for questioning, and I can freeze their accounts pending investigation." "Mrs. Walker, are you willing to press charges?" My mother looked at me, and I saw my father in her eyes, the steel that had been hidden under months of manipulation and fear. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I want to press charges." Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call. Within minutes, 2 local police officers arrived to take Gerald and Patricia to the station for initial questioning. As they were led out, Patricia turned back one last time. "You have no idea what you're doing," she hissed at my mother. "We have lawyers. We have connections. You'll regret this." "The only regret I have," my mother said, her voice steady now, "is that I didn't call my son sooner." The door closed behind them, and suddenly the house felt huge and empty. My mother sat back down at the table, staring at the documents she'd almost signed. I sat beside her and took her hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked gently. She was quiet for a long moment. "They said you'd try to take control. Gerald told me that adult children always try to put their parents in homes, take their money, make decisions for them. He said if I told you, you'd think I was senile, incompetent. And I was so tired of being alone, Robert. After your father died, the house felt so big and so empty. Gerald was friendly. He visited every week. He remembered my birthday. He made me feel like I mattered." I felt tears burning behind my eyes. "You do matter, Mom. You matter more than any house or any money. And I would never put you in a home or think you were incompetent. You're the strongest person I know." "I don't feel very strong right now," she whispered. "Strength isn't about never being fooled," I told her. "It's about what you do when you realize you have been, and you chose to fight back. That takes real courage." Marcus was still going through documents, his laptop open, cross-referencing names and numbers. "Robert," he said after a while, "this is bigger than I thought. I'm seeing connections to at least 15 different victims just in this county. And if Gerald was telling the truth about a network, this could be interstate. That makes it a federal case." "How long until we get her money back?" I asked. Marcus's expression turned sympathetic. "Months, maybe longer. We have to trace everything, freeze the right accounts. build a prosecutable case. Some of the money might be gone already, spent or moved offshore for real. I'll do everything I can, but you need to prepare for the possibility that recovery might be partial. I looked at my mother. She'd saved for 40 years with my father. They'd sacrificed vacations, new cars, luxuries, all to build that security. And now it might be gone forever. We'll figure it out, I told her. You can move in with me. We'll sell the house if we have to. You're not going to be alone, and you're not going to be destitute. I promise you that. That night, after Marcus left with boxes of evidence, and my mother finally went to bed exhausted, I sat alone in my father's old study. The room still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, even after 2 years. I found myself talking to him, the way I used to when I was stuck on a difficult case. I missed it, Dad, I said to the empty room. All the signs were there, and I missed them. I should have visited more. I should have paid attention. But even as I said it, I knew my father would have told me the same thing I'd told my mother. You can't change what's already happened. You can only decide what comes next. What came next arrived faster than any of us expected. Marcus called me at 7 the next morning. We arrested 3 more advisors overnight, he said without preamble, all connected to the same network. And Robert, you need to see what we found in Patricia's office. I met him at the FBI field office 2 hours later. He led me into a conference room where the walls were covered with photographs, flowcharts, and documents. In the center was a whiteboard with names and lines connecting them like a spider's web. This isn't just elder fraud, Marcus explained, pointing to the board. It's organized crime. Patricia's law firm has been providing fraudulent documents for at least 5 years. They target recent widows and widowers, people who are grieving and vulnerable. Gerald and his associates befriend them, gain their trust, then systematically drain their accounts and steal their property. How much are we talking about? I asked. So far? We've identified 37 victims. Combined losses exceed $8 million. The number was staggering. $8 million, stolen from people who'd worked their entire lives, who'd trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. But here's the thing, Marcus continued. Most of these victims never reported it. They were too embarrassed, or they didn't realize they'd been defrauded, or the perpetrators convinced them it was their own fault. Your mother might be the first victim who's actually fighting back. She's not fighting back, I corrected him. We're fighting back, and we're not stopping until every single one of these people is behind bars. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about financial fraud than I'd ever wanted to know. Marcus walked me through the schemes, the shell companies, the forged documents, the manipulation tactics. I attended meetings with prosecutors, gave statements, helped identify other potential victims. My mother moved in with me temporarily, though we both knew it might become permanent. She struggled at first, embarrassed to need help, angry at herself for being fooled. But slowly, something shifted. She started going to a support group for fraud victims that Marcus had recommended. She met other elderly people who'd lost everything to similar schemes. And instead of withdrawing, she became their advocate. Someone needs to warn people, she told me one evening. Someone needs to tell them that these predators exist, that they target grief and loneliness. She started speaking at senior centers, sharing her story, teaching people the warning signs. At first, it was hard for her. She'd break down crying in the middle of presentations. But she kept going, and gradually, her voice grew stronger. Meanwhile, the investigation expanded. Federal prosecutors from 3 states got involved. The network turned out to be even larger than we'd thought, with connections to corrupt probate attorneys, nursing home administrators, and even some bank employees who'd looked the other way or actively participated. Gerald tried to cut a deal, offering to testify against his partners in exchange for a reduced sentence. Patricia hired expensive lawyers and fought every step of the way, but the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus and his team had built an airtight case. The trial began 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner. I sat in the courtroom every single day, my mother beside me. She'd aged in those 6 months, the stress carving new lines around her eyes. But there was also something new there, a determination that hadn't been present before. 23 people were ultimately charged. The trial took 4 weeks. Victim after victim took the stand to tell their stories. An 80-year-old man who'd lost the farm his family had owned for 3 generations. A 76-year-old woman who'd had to move in with her daughter after losing her retirement home. A widower who'd given his late wife's life insurance payout to an advisor who promised to double it. When it was my mother's turn to testify, I watched her walk to the stand with her head high. She looked directly at Gerald as she described how he'd befriended her, how he'd made her feel safe and cared for, how he'd slowly convinced her to sign over everything she had. "Did you trust him?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," my mother said simply. "He told me he wanted to protect me, and I was so lonely after my husband died that I wanted to believe someone cared." "And when did you realize he was lying?" My mother's eyes found mine across the courtroom. "When my son walked through that door, when I saw the look on his face, I knew. I'd been waiting for someone to see what was happening. I just didn't know how to ask for help." The defense tried to paint my mother and the other victims as willing participants, as people who'd made bad investments and were now looking for someone to blame. But the evidence was too clear. The forged documents, the shell companies, the coordinated effort to target vulnerable people. It all pointed to a deliberate, organized criminal enterprise. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned with guilty verdicts for all 23 defendants, the courtroom erupted in applause. The judge had to call for order 3 times. I looked at my mother and saw tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. The sentencing came a month later. Gerald received 15 years in federal prison. Patricia got 12, though she continued to maintain her innocence. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 18 years, depending on their level of involvement. But the victory felt hollow when the asset recovery specialist gave us the final numbers. Of my mother's $340,000, they'd managed to trace and freeze $112,000. The rest was gone, spent or hidden so well that even the FBI couldn't find it. "It's not fair," my mother said quietly as we left the courthouse after sentencing. "They destroyed so many lives, and we still lose." "They lost more," I reminded her. "They lost their freedom, their careers, their reputations. And you gained something too." She looked at me questioningly. "You found your voice again," I said. "You stopped being afraid." A year has passed since that Thanksgiving dinner that changed everything. My mother still lives with me, and honestly, I've gotten used to having her here. The house doesn't feel empty anymore. We have coffee together every morning, and she tells me about the calls she's been getting from people who saw her story in the news. People asking for help, asking how to protect themselves or their elderly parents. She started a nonprofit last month, a hotline for suspected elder fraud. She answers calls 3 days a week, listening to people's stories, helping them find resources, encouraging them to speak up. The woman who was too afraid to tell her own son what was happening has become someone others turn to for help. We still haven't sold her house. The legal proceedings are finally complete, and it's fully hers again. She's thinking about turning it into a meeting space for fraud victims, a place where people can gather and share their stories without shame. "Your father would have liked that," she told me last week. "He always said that house should be filled with people, not just things." I think about Gerald sometimes, sitting in his federal prison cell. I think about Patricia, still insisting she did nothing wrong. I wonder if they ever think about the lives they destroyed, the trust they betrayed. Probably not. People like that rarely do. But I also think about the other victims who've found their voices, the families who've reconciled, the systems that have been changed because of what happened. Several states have passed new laws, strengthening oversight of financial advisors who work with elderly clients. Training programs have been implemented. Awareness has grown. My mother's money is mostly gone. The house needs repairs we're still saving for. Some nights, she still wakes up from nightmares about signing those documents. But when I see her on the phone, talking to a frightened elderly person who thinks they're being scammed, her voice calm and confident and sure, I know we didn't lose. That phone call I made on Thanksgiving, the one to Marcus, it wasn't just about stopping one crime. It was about breaking a pattern, exposing a network, and showing that vulnerable doesn't mean powerless. I'm Robert Walker, and this is my story. This is my mother's story. And if it sounds familiar, if you know someone who's been targeted or you've been targeted yourself, know this. You're not alone, you're not foolish, and it's never too late to fight back. Subscribe to Whispered Vengeance to hear more real stories about fighting for justice when the system fails. Like this video if you believe that age should be respected, not exploited. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my mother's place? What city are you watching from? Your support helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Thank you for staying until the end. Your attention is the first step toward change.